This is Tony Wright. It's the 15th of November 2012 and I'm talking to Chris Green. So can you tell me your full name and where and when you were born?
I'm Christopher Stephen Green. I was born in Harrow, London, on the 8th of May 1954.
Harrow, that's up Middlesex way, isn't it?
It is indeed.
And what was it like in Middlesex when you were growing up?
Interesting, suburban and a bit boring. And I went to the local primary school, and I thought that was the boundary of my life, of my world. I was in the Cubs and so on, and my mother was the arcala of the Cubs, but I was not allowed to be put in her pack because she thought they might have too much influence. She might be too nice to me, so I was put in the Wednesday pack as opposed to the Monday pack. And I went to school at the local primary school, and I thought I was king of that. I was captain of the football team, and I played football the previous year, a year up from everyone else, the only kid to do that. But then my first match, I scored an own goal. It sort of ricocheted off me. And the balls were so heavy, you couldn't kick them anywhere, you know, sort of heavy leather balls in the mud, you know. But I was so mortified, you know, to score an own goal at that age. Tears running down my face, you know. So, but there were the usual things at primary school: chess club and a recorder club, and there was still an 11 plus, but in those days, and I was put in for a scholarship to the local public school, and I didn't know anything about these differences and so on in those days, and I took this exam, walked to this school up this amazingly long drive, and sat there and was asked interesting questions, and it was things like, where are the Pyrenees? And I said something like, oh, they're between France and Italy. Well, I got a bit of it right, so I guess that's why they gave me a place, you know. So I still believe that was incredibly unjust, in that it's a use of local authority taxpayers' money to subsidise some young men from ordinary schools to go into this privileged environment at a major cost to the local taxpayer. You know, there were 10 kids a year got this scholarship, 10 boys a year, I might add, of course, because it was a boys' public school. And of course, that then becomes your formative years, because that was me for the next 7 years, from 11 till 18.
In Harrow School, that famous Harrow
Not
School?
Harrow School.
No.
We used to play them at Rugger, of course, and we used to play Eton at Rugger, but Eton were regarded as crap at Rugger, a bit sort of soft, but Harrow, that was a grudge match.
Right.
And so my school was called Merchant Taylors, but we used to play Harrow, Westminster, Rugby, Mill Hill. All these top boys' schools are grouped around London. You know, there's a few in the north, you know, mostly, and Haileybury and ICS. That name, Haileybury School, stands for Haileybury and Imperial Services College. Can you imagine?
Yes. Merchant Taylors, isn't that a guild going back to the Middle Ages?
It certainly is. That's where they make their money, and they're still in London, the Merchant Taylors Hall.
Right.
When I was in 11, in my first year, we got a trip to visit Merchant Taylors Hall and get lectured about sort of the history of it all.
Yes.
And then we come back on the underground, and there were 4 or 5 of us, sort of lads, 11-year-old lads, sort of just enjoying ourselves, running up and down the track, whatever we were doing. Somebody wrote to the head teacher, the headmaster, of course, and complained. And then when we got back to school, our form master would just say, oh, hello lads, you know, how did you get back from, you know, and extracted the information that us 4 had travelled back together, sent us off to the head teacher, where we got beaten.
Really?
For not standing up, and obviously for this lady on a train, and for causing too much noise and so on, you know. So it was 2 strokes of the cane. That was my sole experience of corporal punishment, right. And I don't think it's a good idea.
Right. So you sound like you didn't really enjoy being there.
Oh, I'm not sure that I did or I didn't. I wasn't. The biggest issue for me was I suddenly wasn't the cleverest kid in the class anymore. Right. And I think that makes more of a difference when kids change from sort of small school to big school. And gradually over the years, of course, I started to realise about privilege and the fact that most of the kids who were at that school had come in at the age of 13, having spent 4 or 5, 6 years at prep school, preparatory school, which again is fee paying. It's, you know, for the children of the privileged, for the boys largely of the privileged, and we used to go and play them at sports. When I was in the 11-year-old class, we used to play the top teams at the prep school. So I saw a few of these places. I was just quite extraordinary. Some of them were boarding schools. You know, it's just barbaric is the word I would use, but also barbaric privilege.
Right.
But of course, you realise that vast numbers of the Conservative cabinet come from this background, have never experienced anything remotely about real life, never met many people in real life apart from being able to talk down to them. You know.
So would it be true to say that you've become politicised because of your education?
I would say it was partly that. My parents were good socialists. They used to vote Labour and read the Sunday Citizen, which was a Sunday newspaper. You know, it was a mass circulation, the Sunday paper. And my father was also always a very committed non-combatant, for example, in the Second World War. And so they had a very equal relationship, which has informed my work and my life ever since.
So after Harold, then what happened to you then?
Then I went off to university up in Manchester. Not again, thinking my parents and I all agreeing that it'd be a good idea to go away from home. Not because I didn't enjoy my home life, but there was always a certain amount of tension when you're 17 or 18. So I packed my stuff up into a friend's Triumph Herald car. Nick Cavendel, he had a car. I didn't even think about cars, and we drove up to Manchester. He was going to a college in Manchester, so was I, and there I was.
Right. What did you study there?
Economics and sociology. And it's the sociology which stuck.
Right, okay. And how did you find Manchester compared to Harrow then?
I was always involved in the political groups. I was very proud of myself. I was elected to the student council in my first year. I was the youngest person to be on it, and I was external relations officer, which meant I was like foreign secretary for the university. It's so arrogant to think that was so important, you know. We had stuff involved in, we were involved in South African Liberation Society, and also I did environmental action. I remember we went into stores and said, this product is overpackaged. We ran a free bus. Again, with the basis of grant, people were so suspicious. Why is it free? You know, because we want to show that free transport is better than cars. You know. And the same with the overpackaged products. It was just environmental issues, ecological issues, and this is 1972, you know. And I was also involved in other parts of the peace movement as well. Did a very interesting summer projects while I was at university. First summer vacation, I always worked in the summer as well to make some money, but after working in the summer I went to Tanzania with a bunch of people from Third World First, and then we all split up and went to separate villages, which was interesting, and again, very, very educational for me. And the year after that I went to Northern Ireland and worked in the peace movement in Northern Ireland in a youth club in Derry, and at the time some bombs went off at the Tower of London from the IRA, and it was a challenging time to be there. I had passes to say who I was because I was challenged by local kids saying, who are you? And they'd report to other people who I was, and also the British Army would want to know who I was wandering around there.
Right.
And I was staying in a flat or in a house with a lady there, and I went back up through the streets one night, and there were British soldiers in my front garden, sort of, you know, patrolling, hiding in gardens, seeing who was out and about. It was just eye-opening, an ordinary terrace of houses in the UK and soldiers in the streets, and it was just, for me, was just so bizarre, you know,
Yeah.
but also made me very much interested in the peace movement and committed to peace activities.
Did you see any violence there, or the marches? Any of the marches?
No. I was in a meeting in a pub, sort of a very political Trotskyist group, militant, having a militant fringe organisation, and they were having a meeting, and the soldiers just came up and arrested 2 or 3 people in the meeting, just took them out, banged them in the back of what they used to call a pig, took them off to one of the police stations, and of course we all had to troop down to protest about it, you know, and say, and maybe after a few hours questioning they might get released, you know, I can't remember what happened.
Right.
But low level violence.
Yeah.
I've been, since then, if we want to jump a few years, I've been to Palestine, and that's there I saw real violence there, of course. I mean, shockingly real violence, and very interesting. First time I've been in morgues and seen bodies. First time I've been on the streets on my own, just me in a tank, you know, because I was a foreigner, I was allowed to break the curfew, because I had a phone, a camera and a British passport, and to encourage little kids to break the curfew, because if little kids are breaking the curfew...
Hang on.
No! Yeah, I went to Palestine as a result of a young woman in Hebden Bridge who had been in Palestine, who had an article in Bridge Times about being shot, and then talked about it, and I thought, if she can work for the International Solidarity Movement for a few weeks, or she was there for a lot longer than that, but I can manage a few weeks in my summer holidays and so on. And I went with another Hebden Bridge resident, Mike Pryor, and that was completely eye-opening, as I say, to work we were given different places to work in, help support people picking oranges and picking olives, and to find the settlers coming down with machine guns and saying, you know, you've got to move. And we were able, because we were foreigners, to really stand in between them. But they were scary people, the settlers, because they're not even as disciplined as the Israeli army. They completely go off on a tangent. And that was really, you know, I got frightened. The Israeli army do not really frighten me, because they are subject to, hopefully, rules, and by and large, because you're from Britain, they won't touch you. If you're Palestinian, they don't have no such qualms. And that was, as I say, that to stand there and say, when there's someone who's blaring through a loud hailer saying, and a tank saying, go home, you must observe the curfew, and your legs are shaking like jelly, and you think, nothing's going to happen, but it's just the daunting prospect. But I've never met such a welcome, and any of the Palestinians we were with would stand in front of you if there was any danger, you know, because they were so wanted to protect you because you were their guest, and they would give you things, you know, their last meal. Lovely people.
So was that in the West Bank or Gaza?
That was only in the West Bank. Our coordinator had said to me, just as I was leaving, that they thought I was a stable enough chap that I could manage Gaza, because it's so easy to get so emotionally caught up in it that you want to do something and do inappropriate actions in terms of just, which would risk your own safety and your safety of the people you were with if you go charging up at a soldier and start shouting at them, which is what you want to. I helped a number of ambulances get through checkpoints. That's one of the things I did, work with the ambulances at night, and you sit there, the ambulance call comes in, and you're just talking them through checkpoints by being nice and talking about football with the soldiers. You might get them through a checkpoint half an hour earlier so that somebody who's sick in the back gets into the hospital.
Right, I see. What kind of attitudes did you find amongst the Palestinian people? Because I suppose if you want to relate it to like the IRA and the Northern Ireland sort of thing, it's all based on religion, but it's not in a lot of ways it's not, is it? And isn't the Palestinian-Israeli thing very similar? It's not really about religion, it's about power, really.
Yeah.
Can you equate the two?
Yes, it's about occupation and so on, you know. And for example, as we speak, the Israeli government have just assassinated a Hamas militant leader in Gaza. But that's not the point. The point is that they want is to kick off an escalation of violence, because even the BBC said yesterday there is an Israeli election coming up in January, and it's just so calculated. And the fact that 10 Palestinians have died in the bombing, and it says 3 Israelis are reported to have been injured. And you think they look for somebody who's got a scratch and say, you know, and absolutely people shouldn't, the militants should not be sending missiles into Israel. But those missiles are pretty useless, and it's a bunch of guys wanting to retaliate. You know, you just think, and of course you understand why they want to retaliate, but the retaliation is so futile. You're based against one of the most experienced, one of the largest armies in the world. They know, and that's all. Who are also using remote control missiles and bombs and so on. That's what I get very upset about. But nobody should be being violent. But I think I might have saved lives in terms of going to Palestine. I'd be doing more Palestinian stuff if I wasn't now completely caught up in something called White Ribbon Campaign.
Yeah. Well, okay, after university then, what did you go back down south, or did you stay up north?
Because I didn't want to be one of those people who just hangs around and becomes a long-term student, I chose to go back to London, even though I hadn't really got a job to go to, like so many young people these days. But I went back down south. I stayed for one more year and did a youth and community work diploma. And then I thought people would be offering me a job. I was 22, I knew all about how to run communities, how to run youth clubs. And after a few months of doing odd jobs here and there, I worked for an organisation called Patchwork Community, which worked for, it was a building organisation, so we would go out and repair short life properties for short life licenses, not licence squatting, in other words, for 6 months, a year, sometimes 10 years they were occupied for. And that's patchwork housing. But I was also living in a community of about 7 people, where some people had more problems than other people, drugs, drink and so on. And that was a very useful community. I was living in communities for most of the time. I was in Manchester, shared houses they started out with, and then communes they were called later on.
Yeah, right. So how did you come back up north then?
I worked for a number of years as a youth worker in London, in Stoke Newington, for the Methodist Church, and run two youth clubs there, and that was very interesting. To Stoke Newington, a very big black community, and on a disco night, or whatever they call it, a sounds night, I'd be the only white guy in the building. There'd be about 200 kids in there with sound systems blasting through the walls, and I would sort of like just stay in the kitchen counting the money, and that kept the youth club going for all the rest of the time. But it was hardly youth work as I knew it. It was like running a commercial disco, which I wasn't equipped for. I was neither equipped for nor wanted to do in my life. And I did that for a couple of years, and then I set up a workers' co-op. I set up a workers' co-op. I mean, I had the idea, I started it, and then other people joined us, and we gradually got a few more full-time staff, and to do printing and badge making and t-shirt making and just propagandising, being a thorn in the flesh of the establishment.
Right.
And I did that for 3 years, and then I had a sort of a row. That's the trouble with co-operatives. You can't get your own way. And I left, probably so associated with that time. I had some mental problems, breakdowny problems, So I ran away back to North, back to somewhere, the house where some of my people had come. And I remember I stole some of my equipment back, which was really childish instead of discussing it properly. But, you know, my badge machine for this and that. And we ended up talking it through sort of some months, years later. But it's sort of, I was being very angry about it. I definitely had paid for this equipment, etc., etc., but that's not the point. It was still not a very mature way to handle things. And so I came back north and set up the same sort of operation here. It was called Trojan Printing in London, we called it Raven Printing in the north, and the same sort of idea. A local community print collective in Manchester, and also our own catalogue of badges and T-shirts and so on, which was fun.
Was that in central Manchester?
It was in central Manchester, Great Ancoats Street.
Right.
The building has now been knocked down as unsafe. And we owned one floor, and also because I had to share the costs, we advertised for other groups to be in there, and the Northern Animal Liberation League had a share, and those were seriously political people.
Yeah.
Lovely people, but not if you did anything to hurt an animal, you know. We called them the animals, and they were serious militants.
Yeah.
And I was very pleased with the work we did both in Trojan and at Raven, and it was the same sort of thing that I do now. It's just sort of bits of activity, sort of community activism. It's the people coming to you who are the interesting people, saying, I want to print 500 leaflets to stop the demolition of this building or something like that. And the orders you get from when you've got some radical T-shirt down with a system, and you get an order from Eton College, you think, yes, that's really fun. I hope those ideas stay with you. You know? But as you can tell, as you're laughing, I always had to try to have fun in my life. And that's what my life has always been about.
Yeah, yeah. So, how did you come to Hebden Bridge then?
I got a job. After that, I was applying for jobs, and I was working in workers' cooperatives, and I saw this job for a cooperative development officer. And when I was younger, I always thought those were sell-out people, you know, because they get paid by the city council to help people support co-ops. But of course, as you get older, you think, oh, a salary would be a bit nice. And I really didn't know where Calderdale was or anything like that, so I came for the interview into Halifax, and they said you'd be based exclusively in the Upper Valley, Hebden Bridge in Todmorden. And I got a job. I got the job, which was very nice. And the office was in Todmorden. But I didn't go about it properly the way local authority people are supposed to. When I needed office equipment, I went to an auction and bought it. Instead of buying it at sort of 10 times the price through the Yorkshire purchasing organisers, because I knew I had a budget of £35,000. I thought, well, the more we save, the more we can give to community groups. It doesn't work like that in councils. And I remember we had some good times as a co-op development worker. The North of Watford Actors Agency was set up during my time there. Number of people doing in the food industry, apples, cooperative making, chutneys and sugar-free foods. The number of Aurora, which was a whole food shop, were already existing when I arrived here. The Bear in Todmorden. So it was a whole food based, but you always got people applying to run a sandwich stall, and you think, oh, this is hard work. They just want a job. And I had the power to help them work out their business skills and their business plan, and then give them £1,000. And people always say, £1,000 for that, we can change the world, and you can't. You know, it's just a tiny little fraction of the amount of money needed. But the Calderdale Canal Cooperative was set up to run trip boats up and down the Calderdale Canal, and that was another real possibility. And there was another travel agency called Mills and Moores Tours, which was to offer tours to this area based on the Labour and Socialist history, and I thought that was a really interesting one as well.
And that was based in Tod, was it?
Todmorden, Hebden Bridge, yeah. I served the whole valley, but my job was to be based up.
But that particular Mills and Moores sounds fascinating, but I've lived here for a long time, and I don't remember hearing about that.
Exactly, that's it. It's to do with public relations, and so, I thought when we had a full page advert in the Hebden Bridge and Todd News with all the co-ops having little adverts around the side, I thought that was so much public relations publicity, would be great.
Yeah.
And you just realise nobody notices. You have to keep on and on and on with public relations and publicity. And I'm really, none of the businesses that I was working with did enough.
Right. So that's a lesson for anyone now wanting to start up. That should be a big part of their, promoting themselves.
Yeah.
Longevity comes through promotion.
Yeah, I think so. And I think ambitious funding expectations. Don't try and be the cheapest at anything.
Yeah.
That's a recipe for death and disaster. Go for the high end, which is often anathema to people wanting, because if you have sort of social ideals, you want to deliver best value for the lowest price. But no, try increase your margins. Go for high margin stuff.
Right. So how did you get onto working with White Ribbon then?
That comes a bit later, really.
Well, what was before that then?
Okay, well, before I started working between then and I went off travelling for a year. I did a couple of gap years, both of which were relatively recently. I never did it when I was a student. And when I came back from the first one, I didn't have a job because I was working I went from Calderdale Council to Kirklees Council as a community and cooperative development officer, so community businesses, same sort of thing. Then I thought, I've had enough of this, and I want to have some time to myself, have a year travelling, and they wouldn't keep my job open for me, so I threw it in and said, well, sod it, I'll find something when I came back. Since then, I'd got a Master's in Business Administration, which is supposed to be a recipe to making 5 times as much money, but I just thought it was an opportunity to give the social businesses some of the business skills, because they all knew how to hold hands and talk about stuff. Nobody knew about operations management, or really about marketing, or really about budgeting. So I did this MBA, and I thought, well, equipped with that, I can have a year off, go around the world, come back and pick up another job. But when I came back, after a bit of a time as a painter and decorator, which I'm not at all good at, I was just helping other people, I got a job at Manchester Met University. Because I'd been involved in the printing industry before, and I was interested also in business. This was a business lecturer within the printing department, and I thought that married up my skills, and so it appeared I got a job. At the same time, I picked up another job working in Finland, but I didn't want to stay away from the valley, and so I gave up the job as a communications teacher in Finland and came back to work at Manchester Met for the next 20 years or so, 19 years I think it was, and that was commuting along the valley into Manchester, and for the first 10 or 15 years I was playing the game. I was writing books, I was going to conferences, I was working my way up the hierarchy and working very hard with and for my students, and then they closed the course. So it was too expensive. It wasn't quite the appropriate thing for a Faculty of Arts to be printing. It's a bit dirty and practical.
Was that because of computers coming along?
It would have fitted very well with that, because I also taught on a media management MBA in Finland while I was working in Manchester, sort of for a couple of weeks a year. So media, it's cross-platform, it's not a problem. It was more to do with the attitude of some of the fine artists, thinking these people get their hands mucky. When we talk about printing, we mean printing a limited edition of 10. They're talking about printing 10 million, and it just didn't fit, and we were expensive, and our students were, because they were people who just wanted jobs rather than people who felt called to be an artist, we didn't fit at all. So it was unfortunate. So that course got pulled. I then went on to do a bit of jobs here and there. When I had my next year off, my next travelling off around the year, came back, had even less to do, but was still employed by the university. And that was when I started to think about, White Ribbon was set up during that time, and it got busier and busier and busier, and I thought, yes, I will take the plunge, I will go into working on this full time. And that's also another lesson. Take plunges, go for it, jump off the cliffs, somewhere something happens and it makes it worthwhile.
So is White Ribbon, is it a national organisation?
White Ribbon is a national and international organisation. I set it up I set up the White Ribbon UK in my attic, having seen the website of the Canadian campaign. The Canadian was the first campaign, and to be fair, they then said to other people, you should follow this model. And when we started, there have been campaigns in maybe 20 other countries, and there's campaigns in 50 other countries now. But we have grown to be of a size and as the same sort of level of significance as the 4 or 5 other major White Ribbon campaigns around the world. And I see it as our job to help spread the word across the world, as well as, but certainly in the UK.
Right. Well, what is that message then? If anybody who doesn't know what White Ribbon's about, how would you define it then?
We recruit and work with men to challenge other men that men should never commit, never condone or never excuse, and never stop speaking about the importance of opposing violence against women.
Right.
I mean, it's a bit of a long sentence, but that's the pledge, never to speak, so
right.
And that's what wearing the White Ribbon it has meant for the other organisation, that we've taken up that promise as well. I mean, it's very simple. It's the biggest human rights violation in the world, because 1 in 4 women suffer violence by men, and so we think something should be done about it. And so now, increasingly, other organisations think it's the way to create an interpersonal violence-free future is to work with men. Because most men are not violent, most men don't want violence, and it's up to us then to challenge other men and to work on our own feelings, do a bit of our own education to make sure that we never get involved in violence.
Now, if you say most men aren't violent, okay, I think I would probably agree with that. But if 1 in 4 women are experiencing violence, that means there's an awful lot of violence going on. And is it just a kind of a small proportion of men doing a lot of violence, or is it, when you say most men, you know, 25% of men are creating violence and 75% aren't? Is that what you mean?
That would still be most men, but in fact, I mean, there are some serial offenders as well. I mean, there's plenty of evidence to see some men go from one partner to another partner, and they repeat their behaviours. But I think it's up to us to work on ourselves all the time, and because it's not just about the physical violence. Because when I said 1 in 4, it's really that's what's recorded as usually as physical violence. Yeah. But there's the threats of violence, the emotional violence, the psychological threats, which we all might want to get our own way at any one time. And I think we have to sort of step back and say, no, let's just negotiate. So what's good for me and what's good for you as well.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's really important for us to look at areas of masculinity as well. And when we look at the moment at the messages that young men get from pornography, which is their basic source of sex education, sex and relationships education, because it's not compulsory in the schools, and certainly the academies are all opting out of those sorts of areas of work. So we have to make sure that men start to look at we have to address porn and also prostitution as well as an issue, because when men start to feel a sense of entitlement, I'm entitled to sex when I want, without negotiating, without discussing it, that's when violence is likely to arise later on. And so we have to get rid of the sense of entitlement and replace it with a sense of negotiation and equality and respect and all these things. It's not hard to talk about it. It's sometimes harder to get it into our heads that that's how we should all be behaving. And I think it's very useful for men to talk to other men about their feelings and so on. And that's, I want to move White Ribbon as well to doing that sort of work, as well as just sort of saying, we are against violence, you know, and stuff.
It makes me think about, well, two things really. One is working like a grassroots with individuals or small groups about, excuse me, about getting a new mentality, but then extending that mentality into the corporate world or the government,
Yes.
and those huge, or the UN
Yes.
even, or,
Yes.
or whoever, going for those big organizations so that they can start promoting it as well. So how, the kind of work that you do, how do you deal with those two different sides of it?
Well, we're very interested in working with the corporate sector. Very hard to get them to play ball, but we do have standard policies on violence against women for companies and for organisations. But as you say, it's the how am I going to succeed unless I push and shove and behave in a sort of macho, aggressive sort of way? And that's big changes need to be made. But part of that is the new suggestion by the European Commission to have 40% of women on boards. You know, would be fantastic progress. Where you see the best progress around violence against women are the countries where they have got, in the last few years, a much higher proportion of women into the cabinet. Spain, France, just in the last couple of years, or last year, and there's immediately some changes being put into place. And you think Spain and France, very traditional, very traditional male roles, but they're changing. Iceland, of course, has a lesbian president, you know, and completely unashamedly about it, and doing fantastically brilliant work because they are we are proud to elect this woman, you know, withstand saying we don't care about people's sexuality. So, in fact, I should have said, well, why do I care about it? Because she's the first one, I suppose.
Yeah.
And the first open, well, not necessarily the first one, the first open one. And that Iceland's a pretty traditional male society there as well. But so that electing women to positions is a start, and appointing them to boards and so on and so on. So empowering women is such a major part of the sort of work which we want to do to prevent violence, but also getting men to say, there are other things in life besides power and control, you know, being nice, enjoying stuff. It's better, it's more fun, you know. So lots of interesting, challenging work to go at, and at White Ribbon we don't do enough of that extending, doing men interesting things way. You know.
Yeah, because it seems to me that if at a very high level, whether it's in corporations or government or what have you, there's more women involved, and not just women, but men who have a kind of open mentality about these sort of things, then the ordinary person man who might want to look after his child for 6 months or a year, but he can't because his boss sees it as being bad, and his boss's boss sees it as being bad, and so he's trapped.
Yes, indeed.
Although he might want to, he's trapped within a kind of structure. But if it came from top down as well as from bottom up, it would be a much more open and equal society.
Absolutely. And interestingly, then you start to get opportunities like extension of paternity leave. You know, and for our work as well, for our anti-violence work, men don't want to say, if you say to a guy, well, your daughter might get attacked, I'll do anything to make sure that doesn't happen. If you say, your son might be a perpetrator, I'll do anything to prevent that happening. The average guy in the street would say that, you know. And so to work with men and talk about their children's work is exactly what you were just saying. You know, it's the guys in the home saying these things will be different, and that is something that governments can do by extending paternity leave, and by making it easier for men to have part-time jobs and so on, and for heralding it, and for men in government saying, yes, we think this is a good idea. There was recently an MP who was going to apply for a post as a job share, as an MP. What a great idea, what a great role model, an example, a job share MP. And the media was saying, no, you can't do this, and I said, of course they could. You'd get far more out of them, you know, because two people, as well known, two people sharing a job worked twice as hard as one person. So lots of good examples, lots of good work to be done, but I think you'll hit the nail on the head in terms of, you know, new roles for men.
Right. So do you work with women's groups as well then, in focusing on men's violence?
We would, yes, absolutely. I mean, next week I'm going down to talk to the people who work on the Women's Aid Helpline because they were really interested in talking about White Ribbon Campaign and having a little talk about what we do. But I recently gave a talk to Women Against Violence Europe, and they said centre on the cooperation with other women's organisations, and I was able to list sort of 18 British women's organisations that we worked with, not just as a token level, but a significant level. And we're also members of the Domestic Abuse Partnership, which unfortunately, when I go there, is 8 women and me. And I think, you know, it's domestic abuse. Why shouldn't men be? Men should be saying, yes, I'm interested in this group. You know, and so often that's the case that I go and address women's organisations when I should be talking to the local darts team, the local rugby club, you know, assuming those are men's organisations, the local Freemasons Society or whatever, talking to men.
Right, yeah.
We can go back in time if you like, so we've skated over years and years of my lifetime. Is that right?
Yeah, no, it's fine. Well, what would you like to go back to?
I don't know. I'd like to go back to when I was young.
Well, in reality, or in this conversation?
in reality, I think. I don't understand why I didn't start doing this years ago. 30 years ago, I was involved in sort of men's politics. And it seemed we were talking about the masculinity stuff now. And if I realised we could have started an organisation then, oh my goodness, I would have done so. Yeah. Because I don't think I've wasted 25, 30 years of my working life, but I would have been far more interested doing this sort of work then. And
well, it does seem to me that you have a progression in the sense that you were in a peace movement, which was basically against violence, because war is violent, but it's against violence against children, women, and men, and anybody else, for that matter, that might come in your way. And you've progressed from that sort of universal war, an anti-war thing, to now an almost in a way a wider thing. It's like it's half the people on the planet are men, and so you're trying to deal with that. So in some ways you've focused on a particular gender, but in another way you've widened it out to a lot larger. So I can see the connection of where you're coming from. Don't you feel that somehow?
Absolutely. A couple of things to say about that. I mean, firstly, some of the people we work with have talked about why aren't we working on men and militarism, you know, and I think that's a very interesting big question. I think I would love to. We've done a little bit of work with the army, but not enough, and partly because they have particular issues around domestic abuse and also violence against women generally. It's armies use it, rape is used as a weapon of war internationally, and of course you say, oh, not in our army it isn't, and you think, yeah, just see what happened in the Second World War, or anyway. But the second thing is going back to talk about 30 years ago is that my agenda on men was far wider than it was then. I was talking about men and sexuality, men and reproduction and contraception, men and marriage. I've been happily married to the same person now for, sorry, did I say happily married? Oh, that's a mistake. Happily unmarried, not married to the same person for the last 29 years. And that, for us, that was a political statement, and it remains so, you know. And I think sort of marriage is sort of that sort of, as you said, the marriage ceremony itself is about women serving men and going subservient to men. But it's very difficult when I'm in another country talking about sort of white ribbon and violence against women to suddenly say, well, of course, I want to talk about sexuality, I want to talk about marriage, I want to talk about contraception. But I think those are fundamentally part of the same package about men and violence.
Do you talk to religious groups then? Because an awful lot of, well, the three classics, the Jewish, the Catholic and the Muslim, are all very male-oriented. And an awful lot of violence against women, I would think, comes from those sort of, religious bases.
I did a 2-minute slot on Channel 4 last year, and it was called Can Your God Be a Woman? I thought, well, of course she can, if there's any such thing as a God, But it was, during the week they had different people speaking on it, and I thought, my mouth drops open really. We've got some people that say they believe, and almost it's a guy on the white throne sort of sitting up there. I mean, like, they're mentally ill, these people, in my opinion.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but they've obviously been brainwashed to some extent.
Yes, but brainwashed. And see, people would say I was weird, that I didn't believe this. And I think, no, you prove that this is in existence. And that's the sort of thing, and I think it's very strange that sort of people can... But anyway, it was an interesting show, and I was nervous as hell. I'd done lots of research about it all, and I wasn't able to talk about violence against women and of course the church, and how in the Middle Ages millions of women were burnt at the stake as witches just to keep the status quo. You've got weird ideas. You don't come and let the local priest tell everybody what to do. You're crazy, they're saying. Who's crazy? Just because they're a bit independent.
It's power again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So very, very interesting times. Yes. But I think so. I was trying to challenge it. But yes, we do work with faith communities, and I sort of bite my tongue because to have members of faith communities condemning violence and getting the men in their congregations to do something about it is progress. But I would rather they weren't going into those buildings in the first place. That's
That's a different point, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, we call it baby steps. Somebody wearing a ribbon, it's a baby step of a commitment. Somebody signing a pledge to say, I will not commit or condone or remain silent about violence is another baby step. Somebody having a photograph taken or signing something, another little step along the way. So I just think it starts and maybe gets people to start to think, and what we need to do then is provide the literature and the information so that they can then talk about the wider roles. But that's why I think the media has such an important role, because in 5 minutes they can undo 5 years of our work by reinforcing terrible gender stereotypes. As I said before, I mean, like years ago, pornography was a couple of pictures of women with nothing on in Playboy or something like that. Mm. Pornography now is graphic images of women being upset, hurt, and looking as though they're in pain. And the young men are just thinking, oh, is this what it's like? There's this one. This is how I've got to treat women all the time. This is weird. So these people, we have to roll that back somehow. And somebody recently was talking about having nicer porn. You could call it erotica or what have you. And I think that might well be a way forward. But I haven't talked about that as an issue or broached it. And I think that's probably a bullet that I will be biting in the next sort of year or two, working with groups to try and do that sort of work.
I was going to ask about what you're going to do next, or what your plans are, your most recent and then your forward planning, what kind of things you might be, looking at.
Well, at White Ribbon we know it will continue. The joy was to get it sustainable, and it seems sustainable now. We get no grant from government, but that might change. But at least we get massive amounts of merchandise, and the very fact that people out there across the rest of the world, or the rest of Britain anyway, say, what's happening on White Ribbon Day this year, November the 25th, the International Day to Eradicate Violence Against Women, means that next year they'll be saying it again. Next year, the day, so something will happen. So in that case, I could sort of pack up and stop doing it. But I want to do different work, but in the knowledge that that work will continue in some shape or form. And for example, we've just been asked, or somebody just suggested us having motorbikes as a white ribbon, and we've just developed a design which has these white ribbon coming out of the exhaust of a motorbike, because a biker said, oh God, I could sell these at some big rally. And in New Zealand White Ribbon Campaign, they have motorcyclists going round for 2 weeks, roaring up into a town, hundreds of these guys and women, and just say, right, we want to talk to you about masculinity. What a cool thing. So that sort of diversification means that we can keep spreading the message in different ways. And I want to diversify, as I say, into sort of me personally looking at wider issues of masculinity. I was chair of something called the Coalition on Men and Boys, but that got a grant for 1 year or 2 years, and then the grant finished, and that's a suicide note for an organisation. Give people money and then take it away, because it just ceased to be. And the national organisations which were part of the coalition sort of completely disappeared, and so we just didn't have anything to work on. But to look at that sort of thing, a bunch of men's organisations in different areas, men's health, men and sport, if you like, men and schooling and education, men and work, just talking about all these sorts of areas and having to try and set some policy. Because you said, to get parliamentarians doing stuff is a good sign, change laws, but also local groups. I once met a guy who wanted a couple of £1 million to set up a men's group in every community in Britain. And I thought, it's a great idea. I think a couple of £1 million is like going to be the problem. But to have men's groups, when I first moved to Hebden Bridge, I was in a men's group, and last 2 years ago, another little local men's group got set up, and I keep joining them, but they have no momentum, they have no reason to exist.
Well, a funny thing that just struck me, you spoke earlier about being in like the Cubs or the Boy Scouts when you were young. You would think that you might be able to get the message to those sorts of young men at an early age if it was part, they'd have to win your badge as something that they did.
A great idea. And we are in touch with national youth organisations, but interestingly, and of course typically, it is the Girl Guides who are running a big violence against women and girls campaign, and the Scouts think, oh, it's nothing to do with us. And that's the way we have to conquer that. And I've said, can they put us in touch with their equivalent in the Scout? But it's the way of just getting in to people at an important senior policy level for them to say, yes, we will make a badge. That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
It's always opening doors, but we are getting doors opened to access at governmental levels. And in fact, in the last few days, I've been appointed a United Nations men's leaders group, which is about 20 men around the world, and I was thrilled to get that request. And some of them are prime ministers who've done particularly important work in their countries, others are leaders of men's organisations in other parts of the world where they have active anti-violence activity, like in South Africa, South America and North America. So I think that shows that sort of we're making progress into being recognised and being known about.
Sounds fantastic.
It is, but it's only a question of doors opening. And the more you do, the more you realise people say your work is useful and important, and the more you realise you need to do even more, because once every 6 seconds a woman cries, once every 3 days a woman dies. And so our job is to get men to speak out about this all the time, and as I said before, change our own behaviour as well.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, we're getting there to the hour mark.
Yeah.
Is there anything that I haven't actually asked about that you would like to say something about?
Hebden Bridge, let's go back to Hebden Bridge.
Okay.
last week or the week before that somebody had a 40th birthday party in Hebden Bridge, and it was in the town hall. And
I
it was
went.
40 years of Hebden Bridge, and it was fantastic. And it was all the people there talking about the history of all the issues. And somebody else, another story which adds to that. I was going to say that's one reason I want to live here forever, except for the damp. Because it's a wonderful place. But I was in London and a couple of weeks ago taking pictures of MPs, and one of the people who works for one of the Parliamentary Labour Party said, "Oh yes, my sister lives in Hebden Bridge, and she describes it as treacle. You move there and you never leave because your feet are stuck to the floor." And because it's such a wonderful place, because there's such a sense of community, and I don't understand why it's so different. And it's the heritage. I came here almost by accident, and I hope that I've added a little bit to the rich heritage. But I feel I've benefited hugely from the heritage of the modern incomers, as it were, the hippies, if you want to say shorthand, who've helped enormously with my education and my social life, and having a great time here.
Right, okay.
There's probably loads more. There's always this later on. I wish I'd talked about that. I wish I'd talked. I don't feel I've talked enough about how wonderful Hebden Bridge is and the wonderful people I've met here. And I always go off and start to preach about the White Ribbon Campaign instead of talking about our experiences.
That's fine.
That's
hopefully,
fine.
our next project will be in 6 months or maybe longer, it depends. We'll be talking to all those types of people that came. And we want to tie a thing in with the so-called hippies, the incomers, we want to look at all the shops as well. We'd like to do it in Mytholm Road because a friend of mine, born and bred here, there used to be 46 shops in Mytholm Road and something like 48 different works, and he's drawn me a map of where they all were and what they're all called, and now there's not that much here. And it'd be very nice to do a project on looking at the shops in Hebden and Mytholm Road and comparing, looking at the change and why Mytholm Road's gotten smaller and Hebden Bridge has got bigger, and they're only a mile apart. It would be a very interesting thing to look at.
I think people often, when they talk about the building we're in now, say, "Oh yes, I remember when it was la 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 la," and people who do know the area, I think that's a great project. It'll be really fun. But all your work, all your project ideas sound fantastic and
well,
fun.
if we get that together, I'll come back and talk to you again about all the old people, well, all the incomers, yourself included, and all of that side of it.
Yeah, and I think it's all been. I feel very privileged, and that's why you sort of then feel the opportunity to give something back. But the trouble is, if you give back a little bit, suddenly you get more bonuses. You get invitations to go and talk to these people and meet with these people, and you think, I want to share that out more, not get more for me. But I'll say it's been very a wonderful 40, 50, nearly 60 years, and as long as you keep laughing through life, that's the important thing. Well done, thank you very much, Tony. Well done.
Right, thank you.